Welcome to this session where we are going to. Hello. Welcome to this session. This is your host, Manoj Kulwal from RiskSpotlight, and you have joined the online workshop series on the topic of integrating the management of operational risk into core business processes. I see we have a few participants still joining in, so I'll go through the introduction part, and hopefully we'll have a majority of the participants with us in the next 5 minutes or so. Regarding the session today, you will get the slides. I will email the slides to you, so you don't need to sort of make any notes from the slide. But of course, if you find something relevant for your organization, or you want to make note of a topic of how it applies to your organization, then please feel free to do that. And we're also recording this session, so a recording will also be available in case you want to watch certain parts again, or if you want to share this with other team members. So let me just do a quick introduction of myself. So I'm Manoj Kulwal. I am the co-founder and chief risk officer at RiskSpotlight. We're based in UK, where we provide consulting, content, and training services around operational risk management. As you'll see in this and the following sessions, I am very passionate about risk management, or using risk management as a tool to define and execute a business strategy. Uh, I was part of the UK delegation for the revision of the ISO 31000 standard. So for those of you who are not aware, ISO 31000 is a international standard on risk management, which was created by around 50 organizations for cross-industry purposes. So it's not just focused on financial services, but it took the best ideas from lots of different industries, and it was created into a standard. So I was part of the UK delegation, where each country who's participating in that standard, they sent certain risk experts. So I was part of the UK team, representing UK in that revision process. I've also been very closely involved with Institute of Operational Risk when they were creating the Certificate of Operational Risk Management. So that is a only certification within the industry available on operational risk management, which is provided by a institute focused on operational risk management. So I was part of the team, which initially created that standard and the early days of rolling that out. I have also designed, and what we maintain now is the world's first forward-looking operational risk content service. So while there are lots of content offerings available in the market for loss data, so like the IBM Algo database, the SAS database, ORX, ORIC, they're all backward-looking, where they give you information about the loss data. But when you are doing risk assessments, or when you're building scenarios, you need forward-looking information. And we did around 4 years ago, when we looked at the market, there was nobody offering that. And that's where our team went and created the first forward looking content service, where we look at what are the emerging trends, emerging patterns. And then over 100 financial services firms use that for their horizon scanning and monitoring the emerging operational risk topics. And some of you are already subscribers, or are trialing out the Risk Spotlight portal. But if you have not participated in a trial, and if you want to see whether that content can be useful for your team, then you can go to the Risk Spotlight website on riskspotlight.com, and then register for a free 2 months trial, where you'll get access to all the content. And then at the end of the 2 months, you can decide whether you want to purchase a subscription. And we have various options available for individual subscriptions, starting from $9.90 every year, to team subscription, and even corporate subscription. And I also enjoy training. So that's one of the ways in which I get to meet operational risk practitioners from lots of organizations. And I've done sort of various training courses over the last 8 to 10 years. So through those training courses, and through training courses I've published on YouTube, I've probably trained over 1,000 operational risk professionals over that time period. If you want to know more about me, then I've highlighted my LinkedIn profile there. So let's kick off the session by using this premise that op risk is broken. So I started in operational risk management 15 years ago, where when I used to go to the conferences and when I used to talk to organizations, the sort of issues at that time, 15 years ago, were very similar to the issues organizations are still facing today. And I've highlighted sort of the three main issues here where most firms still find it difficult to get active participation from the first line on things like risk assessments or reporting incidents or monitoring risk. So that was a struggle 15 years ago, and it is still a struggle today. First line wants to provide minimum level of input, so they want to sort of minimize that engagement with the op risk team. So if you go and ask for a lot of information, they'll try and see, okay, what is the least amount of information they can give to the op risk team so that they can get op risk team off their back. And that was an issue 15 years ago. It is still an issue today. And then the quality of information. So luckily, at least over the last 7 to 8 years, we have collected a lot of information. So I don't think there is any shortage of information, but there are question marks on the quality of the information which is being collected for the first line. So yes, we may be doing our risk assessments, but how good is the quality of all that information we are collecting from those risk assessment? There is still a big question mark in a lot of organization. And this is not just my view, but I wanted to share something which was published about 3 4 weeks ago by ORX. So ORX is the consortium for sharing loss data, and it has some of the biggest financial services organization as its members. And it conducted a benchmark. So it outlined a best practice maturity model, and then it compared 73 financial services firms on that maturity model. And here are some of the key findings, which sort of aligns with what I have said so far, where they say the finding was that RCSAs, they're not providing current view of the risk exposure. Uh, and this especially in organizations where there are some large financial services organization where it takes them 6 to 8 months to complete one RCSA cycle. So if it takes that long for an organization to do an RCSA, of course, by the time your RCSA is over, your business environment has changed in those 6 to 8 months. So your risk exposure would be completely different, and you are not going to get the most current view of your risk exposure if your RCSAs take anything more than 4 weeks. Over half of the firms were in the process of moving or are intending to move to an RCSA approach where they want to do periodic, but they also want to do trigger-based RCSAs, where a trigger can be either an incident which happens inside the organization, outside the organization, or some change in the strategy or introduction of some new regulation. So that's a good sign. So at least we are going away from just doing RCSAs on a quarterly or a yearly basis. We are also looking at if anything has changed in our business environment, which should also trigger the need for RCSA. But what the research here found was that firms which have adapted that, the triggers were typically happening at the request of the second line. So its second line is having to go and tell the first line, hey, you need to do this RCSA because there has been this incident in our organization, or there has been this new regulation which has been announced by the regulator. So the first line are not actively doing the trigger-based RCSAs. There is a perception that RCSA process has become a tick box exercise, and that would always happen if you have this cycle where if your RCSAs are yearly, then automatically that creates that perception that I only have to manage my operational risk once a year. And that is sort of one of the ideas we're going to focus on how we can get away from this compliance way of doing RCSAs, because just doing periodic RCSA, it does create that compliance mentality where people just see it as a tick in the box exercise. Firms are not able to use RCSAs to support business decision making. So this was great that at least there was some reference to business decision making, because I haven't seen a reference to business decision making in operational risk context, and that is one of the key themes we're going to cover in this workshop. But at least the findings from this benchmark was that organizations are doing the RCSAs, but they're not finding that the outcomes of those RCSAs are being useful in making an organization make a business decision on whether to outsource a particular process, whether to change the design of a particular business process or launch a product. So there are sort of various decisions a business may be making, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and RCSAs are not helping them in making those business decisions. So that's a very important theme for us. So I'm going to drill down into that a lot more detail. Very few firms reported that first line of defense use RCSA as a key management tool for running the business. And that is also going to be one of the key themes, that risk management or RCSAs, they're not for the purpose of operational risk management. They should be a business tool, which the first line should be using. But of course, the operational risk teams in most organizations, they've made that RCSA so complex that the first line team, does not want to use those complex tools. So one of the themes we're going to touch in the course is how can we simplify the RCSAs so that they are simple, they're practical for first line to use, depending on whatever business situations they are dealing with. RCSAs are not giving a clear view of control effectiveness. Okay, so we've sort of touched on that. Key challenge remains whether the first line is sufficiently skilled to be accountable and responsible for relevant risks and controls. So yes, second line is pushing the ownership and accountability into the first line, but have they had the right training on how to use risk management as part of the day-to-day processes or as part of their day-to-day activities? Some have, most haven't, and that's going to be one of the themes, from our course also, on how we can address that. Because they're not just going to start managing the risk just because the second line is saying, oh, you are the owner and accountable for this risk. They need some tools, they need some guidance on, okay, how do I use it? The second line needs to step away from executing the RCSA and drive the accountability and ownership for the risk management into the first line. So again, we're gonna touch on that, where the second line should be providing more the oversight and providing the framework and the processes, but should not have to get involved. But that requires that the right things have been done with the first line, that they can actually do the right things from a risk management perspective, and only then the second line can step away. And then some institutions are moving away from assessing inherent risk and moving straight to looking at residual risk and control effectiveness, which is also a good sign, because in my experience, a lot of first line individuals, they find inherent risk assessment is a very theoretical exercise. And if you force them to do that every time, they have to do an RCSA, then, it sort of portrays that picture that, oh, this is too complicated, it's very theoretical. So that's also a good sign. So this is sort of the latest view from a benchmark done by ORX, and then there is an executive summary published on this. I've given the hyperlink, or if you just search for ORX RCSA on Google, you'll find the executive summary, and the detailed report is only available to ORX members. So if you are one of those 73 firms who are ORX members, then you should be able to get access to the whole report. Okay, so that sort of outlines this view where when I, so at least, this is a view from my personal perspective. When I started 15 years ago in operational risk, most of these challenges were there, and we haven't addressed those challenges in the last 15 years. And I've just want to put a quote from Albert Einstein here, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that sort of is where I had to take a step back about 3 years ago, where I said that, okay, if I'm not getting the good ideas on how to improve operational risk management within financial services industry, then I need to go and look outside the financial services industry, find where those good ideas are, and then bring that into the financial services industry. And as part of that, over the last 3 years, I have been contacting, traveling, reaching out to as many risk experts as possible outside the financial services space. I had an opportunity to interview a lot of these experts, and then I had I have published those interviews on YouTube. So some of those interviews are published on YouTube. I got involved, yeah, with the ISO standard. Looked at the COSO ERM, looked at OSEGs. GRC capability model. And what I have done is over the last 3 years, I've collected those ideas, sort of designed how do we implement them, but in a simple and effective way, because you don't want to make it complicated, right? That's one of the challenge we have with operational risk right now, is that most of the things in operational risk are very complicated for first line to use. And if we want the adoption to increase in the first line, then we definitely have to significantly simplify what tools and frameworks we use. And that's what this course is about. So what we did was I designed a one-day course, which I taught with UK Finance, which is the UK organization representing the banks and other financial services firm. And we had around 18 operational risk practitioners who came onto that course, where we discussed all these ideas and validated that these ideas are relevant. And once we got that feedback, we are now in the process of sharing this with as wider community as possible. And we are doing these sessions free of cost, because we want to make sure these ideas reach as many organizations as possible. And what we're looking for this series is we're looking for 4 to 5 organizations to sort of raise their hand. And if you're interested in trying out these ideas in your organization, so if you've tried out lots of other ideas to make first line, proactively participate in operational risk management, and you've run out of those ideas, then we have a certain set of ideas we want to share with the community. So we're looking for 4 to 5 organizations to say that, okay, you want to try these ideas, we will implement those ideas, and we're developing frameworks, we're developing processes, practices, we're developing training sessions, we're developing software, because that's also another hurdle in increasing that adoption, that a lot of operational risk management software out there is designed for the second line. It's not designed for the first line. So we're also working with like-minded software vendors to also address that software challenge. So we can come up with a suite of solutions. And we want to work with 4 to 5 organizations where we will roll this out, we will test those ideas, and if those ideas are successful, then we can spread those ideas in a much wider community. So if you do see the ideas we're going to discuss in this session and the next 2 sessions useful and something you would like to try in your organization, then please do let me know, and then we'll try and sort of set up how do we collaborate with that smaller group where we can actually go and implement some of these ideas. So here are those ideas I'm going to talk about, and then the rest of the course, we're going to touch each one of these individually. So the first one we need to, the first solution we need to look at is looking at risk management not as a compliance or a regulatory tool, but as something which is integral part of how an organization defines and executes its business strategy. So when an organization says that, okay, we want to grow our revenue by 20% over the next 12 months, we want risks to be considered on, okay, how realistic is that objective that we will be able to grow our revenue by 20%? Or if an organization says we want to get 30% of our revenue from outside Europe in the next 3 years, you want to look at, okay, what are the risks we will need to take and what are the risks we will need to manage in order to achieve that strategic objectives. So that was one of the findings, that if the risks are not being considered as part of defining and executing those strategy, then of course those strategies, an organization is taking a lot of risk as part of those strategies. And if risk is not considered, then risk is disconnected from how an organization defines its business strategy. So that's sort of one of the themes we are going to drill down into during the course. Then treating managing risk as a core capability for individuals in all key job roles. So when you look at senior executives in your organization, you expect them to have influencing capability. You expect them to have people management capability. You expect them to have negotiation capability. You may expect them to have capability to manage budgets and profit and loss account. And what we need to do is we need to make managing risk as part of one of those capabilities, so that if you are a senior executive, then we train our senior executives on that managing risk in a structured way, and that becomes one of the criteria on how we promote and hire individuals into those key job roles where they are taking those decisions, which exposes organization to risk. Yeah. But treating managing risk as part of that core capability, so it's not an add-on. It's, if you want to be successful in an organization, you need to demonstrate that you're also good at managing risk, in addition to negotiating, managing people, managing profit and loss account, and so on. And some organizations are doing that. So I'll show you examples of job descriptions I found on LinkedIn, where some organizations are very poor at this. There are a few organizations which are starting to embed that, where they're defining, when they're defining the job descriptions for the first line roles, they are integrating management of risk as part of those capabilities. So there are sort of signs, positive signs out there. Then developing a language to discuss business and risk topics in an integrated way. And this is where, as a risk community, we want to be careful how much of the risk language does a first line individual have to learn. And we want to minimize that as much as possible, because risk is then an alien language for the first line. They are used to the business language in terms of market share and customer churn and increasing revenue and launching new products. And we want to try and see how do we develop that language which the first line uses, and risk can easily become as part of that, rather than they having to now start learning, or what is a risk appetite, what is a risk threshold, what is a risk attitude, what is inherent risk, residual risk. That there is a whole host of terms which make sense for risk management teams, but may be very difficult to understand for the first line. So we need to look at that aspect of the language. Then integrating management of risk in all key business decision-making processes. So again, we're going to touch on this in quite a lot of detail, where every business decision first line takes in the organization will either bring new operational risk into your risk register, or will increase the likelihood or the impact of existing operational risk. So these decisions can be upgrading an online banking IT system. It may be outsourcing a critical process to an outsourcing vendor, or start using a cloud provider instead of an in-house IT team for hosting certain IT servers. So there are all these decisions which are being made in the first line on daily, weekly, monthly basis. And each decision is associated, it's changing your risk exposure. And if risk considerations are not part of those decisions, then of course you'll end up making a lot of decisions, and then you'll have to deal with the consequences of not managing the risks correctly when you made the decision. So we're going to look at that aspect, and then also inserting decision making as a core capability. So similar to managing risk, organizations should also train their senior executives, and that's where most organizations you assume that if you've become senior and you sort of got promoted to a senior level, then of course you'll be good at making decisions. So a lot of organizations don't look at that as a separate capability they need to train their executives on. They just assume that it's a given, because otherwise you would not be successful and climb up the corporate ladder. But every executive could do on improvement in terms of decision making, and there's a completely separate discipline. So like risk management, there is also a decision science discipline which has been around for 50 years, which has developed its tools and processes and ways of considering risk when you're making those important business decisions. But a lot of risk management practitioners are not aware of that separate field, and that's where I had to go find out about that field and get a lot of ideas, which we're going to cover in these sessions. Then utilizing different risk assessment approaches to assess risks, because first line, they're doing different things with different levels of criticality. So if we are acquiring a firm, then that is a very risky decision. So you would want to be a lot more rigorous about what risks we may be taking if we go ahead with an acquisition, compared to if you're deciding to outsource a critical process, and then your options are you can outsource it to a vendor in UK, you can outsource it to a vendor in Poland, or you can outsource outsource it to a vendor in India. And each of those options will expose the organization to different risk, but it's not as critical as acquisition of a firm decision. So it's critical, but it's only critical for that one business process which is being outsourced. And then there is another decision in terms of hosting. So if you're doing a company annual meeting where you're going to get 5,000 employees together, you're also taking a lot of health and safety related risks. You may be taking your competitors coming to those kickoff meeting and learning about confidential information about your strategy. So you want to look at the risks associated with that decision. But each of those three decisions, they're different level of criticality, and you cannot use the same risk assessment approach for those three. So you need a simpler risk assessment approach for organizing your annual company kickoff meeting. You may need a slightly more rigorous process for the outsourcing decision, and you need a very rigorous risk assessment process for acquisition of the firm. So what we need to do is we need to create different risk assessment approaches. So depending on what the first line individuals are trying to do, that if they have only 2 hours to make a decision, they should be able to assess the risk, that whatever risk assessment approach we provide, it should be simple and practical enough that within 2 hours, they can use that approach to identify, okay, what are the top risks associated with that decision. If they have 2 months, then they can use a little bit more detailed approach. If they have 6 months to make a decision, then we can the risk assessment approach we provide them can be very detailed. But right now in a lot of organizations, there's only one RCSA approach, and then that's it. But we need to, if we want this to be integrated, if we want first line to look at risks in context of whatever they're doing on the day-to-day basis, we need to give them a range of risk assessment options, and then we'll look at those in a little bit more detail. Assessing risk in quantitative terms, because first line, when they're dealing with their day-to-day objectives, they're dealing in pounds and dollars and euros. But as soon as they start talking to risk, we start talking the language of high and medium and low. And that also creates another disconnect, saying, okay, what does high mean? What does medium mean? And I was initially thinking that it's not possible for operational risk to be quantified. But when I actually went out and looked at the option, it was amazing to find that there are so many simple practical tools on where you can quantify the risks if you understand the business. So the op risk team may not be able to do that because the op risk team is not that close to the risk on the day-to-day basis, but the first line individuals are. They understand the business. So if we give them certain simple tools, it is possible to quantify any risk. So there is no operational risk which cannot be quantified. And then if you want to challenge me on that, then give me the risk you think which cannot be quantified, and I can give you the solution of the steps you can go through to quantify any risk. And if we want first line on board, then we need to do that, because they need to see that, okay, if they don't manage this risk, then there is an exposure in terms of pounds or dollars or euros, rather than, oh, risk is high. And then different people interpret high, differently. Assessing real risks and not risk categories. So this is another common thing I have seen, where the risk register created by the op risk team, you may have 60, 80, 100, 120 sort of risks in like level 3 categories. But a lot of those risks are not real risk from the first line perspective. From the first line perspective, they're very generic. So for them, they see it more as a risk category rather than the real risk they're trying to manage on the day-to-day basis. And we need to allow first line to manage and assess the real risks and not the risk categories, because risk categories are very generic. It's very difficult for the first line, to manage generic risks, because they are managing specific and real risks into their day-to-day context. And we'll cover those approaches in terms of how we can enable that. Segregating the risk management function into risk advisor and risk oversight and challenge role. So this is where in a lot of operational risk team, when we started out, the role of the second line team was to provide more risk oversight and challenge. But you can only do that once the first line knows what they need to do. So, in order to train and get our first line up to speed, the second line team also has to take the risk advisor role, because you need to train them on, okay, how do you identify risk? You need to train them on what do you mean by likelihood of risk. You need to train them on what do you mean by a reputational impact of a risk. And that's where the second line team, is always trying to struggle between those two separate roles, where you need to also be like the risk advisors for the first line until they're independent and they can actually start managing risk on the day-to-day basis. But then the regulators, the chief risk officer, the board is also expecting the second line team to be independent and provide that oversight and challenge role or function. And we need to see how do we separate. And then, of course, I know in a lot of small, medium-sized organization, the operational risk department may just be one person, in which case, yeah, it becomes very difficult to separate those. But if you have the luxury of having 4, 5, or more than 5 individuals in your second line operational risk team, then you can consider how do you separate that, because if the same people are also being the risk advisors and also providing risk oversight and challenge role, then there are a lot of gray areas there where it can create issues, because first line will be very open if you go to them as risk advisors and you are trying to add value to what they're trying to do on a day-to-day basis, but they will be hesitant for communication if you go to them as a risk oversight and a challenge function. Uh, and that's where I've seen, at least in Capital One, when I attended a conference in the US, Capital One has set up a separate a function just for the challenge aspects on operational risk. So that team, then they don't get involved in the day-to-day helping the first line. They just are able to play that independent challenge role. And then the rest of the operational risk team, they can play the risk advisor role, and that actually help out the first line, where you may then get involved in doing risk assessments. You may get involved in identifying risk, in training the first line, so where you are acting more as like a consultant for the first line. And then a big aspect, sort of what I learned when I sort of looked outside financial services, was also looking at the human and cultural factors. So just because you have bought a very expensive operational risk system and you went to a big four consultant and got a super duper operational risk framework and process and you've rolled it out, doesn't mean that it will actually get implemented. And risks, at the end of the day, they are being managed by people. So there are lots of human biases, which come into the mix. There are lots of motivation where humans, are not rational. That the same individual may respond one way in one situation and another way in a different situation. And we need to be conscious of these factors. And then there are also, of course, the cultural factors, where the culture within your retail banking business unit may be very different to the culture within your investment banking, or the culture within your sales team may be very different to the culture within your finance team. So there are a lot of cultural factors within an organization which also can influence how the first line is looking at risk and how do they participate into those risk management activities and processes. So that sort of sets out our agenda, that we're going to drill down into each of these solutions. And then the invitation is open to any organization where you want to try out these ideas in your organization on a small scale basis. And then, yeah, if it is successful, then you can roll it out to a wider group within your first line. Then that invitation will remain open. Okay, so let's then drill down. So we talked about this role of risk advisor and risk oversight and challenge. So this is something where in this course you will benefit if you see yourself as a risk advisor. So if you really want your first line to start managing the risk proactively on the day-to-day basis, and you're ready to help them until they get to the stage where they don't need your help, then these ideas we're going to cover in this course are for that risk advisor in you, and not the risk oversight and challenge in you. right? So that sort of is where we look at risk advisors. So they are proactively providing support to the first line. So they, if the first line is making a decision to launch a new product, then they may actually go and get involved and talk to that product manager and help them out to consider these compliance risks or IT risks, which may be part of launching that new product before the product manager actually goes to the product approval committee to get their approval. So in that case, you are actually helping them because they may not, the first line may not have, because they are product manager, they understand the product, but they may not still be as good on managing risk. And that's where the risk advisor function within the operas team, you are good at managing risk. So if you can go and help them, and then maybe a first 2 or 3 products, they may need your help. But when they're launching the 4th product, if you've given them some good tools, then they will be able to look at those risks without you necessarily getting involved every time they have to launch a new product. And then of course when they go to the front of the product committee, then the risk oversight and challenge part of the operas team can be part of that, and then they can challenge whether all the risks have been considered or not. The risk advisors can get involved in risk and control assessments. They may recommend remediation actions if the first line, if there is a certain high level of risk exposure, it's outside appetite, and they don't know what to do, then that's where the risk advisor part of the operas team can say, hey, we've seen this, the investment banking team has implemented this control, maybe you should consider this. Or from the experience on other financial services organization, you may recommend that, okay, here are some of the controls you can implement. And then, of course, recommending any remediation actions which may be needed for any unacceptable level of risk exposure within the first line. And the risk oversight and challenge, so they stay separate. So they don't get involved in all that helping out the first line, because they've given the framework, and now their job is just to challenge. So they'll just provide the oversight on the risk management processes. So whether the RCSAs are happening at the right moment, they will provide a challenge. So if a first line is accepting a certain high level of risk, then they may go and challenge why that risk has been accepted, and they are the ones who are going to escalate if they are not satisfied with certain risks being accepted. Then they are the ones who are going and escalating that to the senior management board and the risk committee. The risk advisor is not doing that, because the risk advisor is more helping the first line. They are making sure that the first line is doing the right things, so that when the risk oversight and challenge people start looking at the risks, then they don't find lots of gaps and issues. In terms of language, so something which I have found very useful when you, especially we're talking to first line about operational risk management, is just replace the term operational risk management with management of operational risk. Because in their mind, operational risk management is a department in the group level, but management of operational risk is a verb. It's an activity which they have to do. So if you get involved in the conversation saying, okay, what are you doing this year to manage your operational risk, instead of saying, oh, what are you doing this year for operational risk management? So that I have found that one small change, over time in multiple interactions, can then have that effect where, instead of using the term operational risk management, which in their mind is a department, they will, sort of start taking more ownership, because they know that management over operational risk is something they need to do. So it's a very subtle change, but you'll be surprised how effective it can be if it is sort of used on a consistent basis, over a long period of time. So it may not happen in one day or 1 week, but over time, if we make sure that when we talk to the first line, we don't use the term operational risk management, and we use management of operational risk, the activity, the verb, then it'll create that subtle change over a period of time. And then minimizing the use of risk terms as much as possible, and maximize the use of existing business terms, because every organization has its own business language. That there may be certain acronyms which may be used within investment banking, certain acronyms which may be used in wealth management, and you want to try and see how you can keep that business language, and there is not a lot of new terms they need to learn, but of course they will have to learn. So it's not like we can't use the term risk appetite at all. We just need to make sure that we look at every risk management term which may be part of the framework or part of the process, and see whether that term is more for first line, or is it more for the second line to interact with the regulator, or the second line to interact with the risk committee. So if we can at least cut down any unnecessary terms which the first line has to use, then that would be a big plus, because then there's not this whole new language they need to learn, and then there's always reluctance in learning a new language if you have to suddenly learn 60 different risk management terms. And then we have to provide some risk management terms. So where I have seen organizations successful is where they provide a glossary. So you can provide a dictionary where you put those terms which you want everybody to be aware of, which you want the first line individuals to use. But then you have to go through that exercise of embedding that term. So you may have to go through training. You may have to, if you are getting involved in a meeting where they start using the term issue instead of risk, then you may want to correct them, saying, no, in this case it's not a issue, it is a risk. And then over time they get familiar with that term, so they then using the term consistently in those first line meetings. And then you want to try and make it fun as much as possible. So if there are sort of lunchtime quiz, end of the day type quiz, online quizzes which you can organize, or you can have a word of the day communication where an email can go out every day covering a particular term, where you provide an example. So if you want them to become familiar with residual risk exposure, because that's a term we will have to use, then give them an understanding of the term, and then give them some real examples for hopefully which applies to their particular business unit. That if it's going to wealth management, then you want to give a wealth management example. If you want, if you're sending the email to retail banking, then you want to give a retail banking example. That if they can see examples of these risk management terms which are closer to what they're doing on the day-to-day basis, then the retention and the use of that term will be a lot more long-term than short-term. But at least you're having that glossary so that they can easily go and look up those terms. They don't have to go through some complicated SharePoint which only the Operas team can find. So somewhere on the internet, on the homepage, they should be able to easily get to that glossary. And then what I see, a lot of organizations still go and create their own definition of control, their own definition of what is a risk owner, when there are so many good industry standards already out there. So like with ISO 31000, they have already gone and defined 50 most commonly used terms, like what is a risk, what is a control, what is a risk owner, what is a risk appetite. So for these commonly used terms, you should not have to create the definition for your own organization. You want to use what is being used in the industry, so that if there are individuals who come from other organization and join your organization, and if they're familiar with those terms, they don't have to now learn a completely different language which is very specific to your organization. So I'm highlighting the three industry standards here, the ISO 31000, the COSO ERM, and OSEC's GRC capability model. And if you Google for these, you will find those details. And the OSEC GRC capability model is free, but you have to pay about 120, 150 pounds for the ISO 31000 and COSO ERM. Standard, depending on where you're buying those from. But reuse what is there in those industry standards rather than having to create your own definitions, so that you have that argument that, okay, this is industry standard term, it's not specific to an organization. It becomes much easier to sell those definitions. But if somebody internally comes up with that definition, then somebody may want to challenge, saying, oh, I don't think this is the definition of control. And then you spend many days trying to argue what should be the definition of control in our organization. So that's where a lot of work can be done in terms of language, where reducing the amount of risk management terms, which there are some terms we may need in our discussion with regulators, but if the first line doesn't have to bother about those, then we want to just separate those terms, which the first line doesn't have to use in the day-to-day language. And how can we use the business terms which are already being used, and then just making sure that those terms which we've agreed first line needs to use for their day-to-day purposes, then how do we make it easy that they can access it? How do we embed it? And it'll take sort of a few months for them to sort of become familiar with those terms and start using it in a consistent basis. So you want to help them on their learning journey. You can't just organize one course and then say, okay, now everybody should be using that term consistently, or you can't just publish your glossary, send an email, and then expect that, okay, they will now start using the terms as you've defined them in your glossary. So if you come across any questions while we're doing this, then please do ping me in the chat window. So I will leave some time towards the end where we can go through those questions. And I'm going to post those questions on a LinkedIn group, so everybody will have visibility on that. And then we can have a discussion on those questions on LinkedIn, even after we between this session and the next session. So feel free. I will sort of leave some time in the end where I'll look at the chat window and capture your questions, and then whatever we can cover today, we will do that. Otherwise, I'll post them and I'll tell you where they will be on LinkedIn. Okay, so then let's look at this perspective. So now you need to sort of remove your second line hat and think about the content we're going to look at from a first line perspective. So one of the definitions I use for GRC, so if because that's a very commonly used term where organizations are buying GRC software, and there are even some organizations now who have head of GRC instead of head of risk, they have head of GRC. And the reason I wanted to highlight this definition was it really brings everything we're trying to do together. So this definition is from OSEG, which is the Open Compliance and Ethics Group. So it used to stand for that, but now I think they just call themselves as OSEG. So it's oseg.org is their website. And they define GRC, which is a collection of governance, risk, and compliance. So that's what those acronyms GRC stand for. And then what we generally refer to as enterprise risk management is the R of GRC. So they define GRC that GRC is a critical capability. Yeah, so it's a skill, it's a set of skill sets, a set of skills we have in our organization that must work together to achieve principled performance. And that really aligns with all this conduct focus we have, where we don't want to just achieve our sales target, but we want to achieve our sales target in a fair and an ethical way. So it's not about just achieving the target at whatever cost, but doing that fairly and not harming our customers and being fair to them. So that's where that principal performance comes in. That's what, as an organization, we should be aiming to achieve principal performance. But in order to do that, we need the capabilities that integrate the governance, the management, and assurance. So governance is then, the senior executives, the board, who sort of define the strategy, allocate resources. Management is then the execution part. So if we need to launch new product, if we need to, get 1 million more customers. So then the management is doing the execution part. And then there are assurance functions like internal audit, the second line, who then make sure that excessive risks are not being taken by the management to achieve that principal performance. And what we need is we need to look at the performance aspect. So as an organization, we need to build products, we need to sell products, but by doing that, we are exposing our organization to certain risks. So if we want to be successful, then we want to manage those risks. So if our objective is to increase our number of customers by 20%, then in order to achieve that objective, we will need to take certain risks, and we will need to manage those risks so that we will be able to achieve that objective. So there is the performance aspect of what the organization is trying to do. But in order to do that, we have to manage the risk so that we'll be successful. And then all the organizations are tied in that compliance boundary where we need to stay within our legal and regulatory obligations. That whatever we do, we need to stay inside that box so that everything we do is legal and it complies with all the regulations and so on. And then I've created this graphic to highlight the definition where we start on the left-hand side. So the current state is where you are, and future state one is where, let's say, in 12 months' time, you want to be as an organization. And because you are going in the future, so anything which is associated with future is exposed to uncertainty, so it's exposed to the risk. So those red starry shapes are then all the risks you will have to take between now and the 12 months. And then if you are successful, then you'll achieve those business objectives, which are those green dartboards. So those are your 12-month objective you want to achieve. And then the gray box is the compliance boundary, where you need to stay within a certain compliance environment and do whatever you need to do within those boundaries to achieve those objectives. And then you will need to manage those risks. If you don't manage those risks, then you will not be able to, you may not be successful in achieving those particular objective. And then from future state one, you may want to go to future states two. So that may be 24 months down the road. And that's where some compliance may be getting introduced or changing, which may change the shape of your compliance boundary. So the change of the shape is just to give an idea that that compliance environment is also changing. And you need to sort of be aware of that and then manage your business so that you stay within that compliance boundaries. But those objectives will stay and those risks still stay. So this just gives you that highlight that as first line, what first line is interested is they're interested in those green dartboards, that they want to achieve those objectives. And what we need to do is we need to make them aware that in order to get to that, you need to manage these risks, because if you manage these risks correctly, there is a higher likelihood that you will be able to achieve those objectives. So they don't have to manage the risk just because the operational risks team is asking them to manage. And that sort of is one of the message we want to get across, that they are taking those risks whether they like it or not. And how can we now help them get better at managing those risks? So whatever objectives they have outlined, there will be a higher likelihood of them being able to achieve those objectives. And then this is what then every organization at a high level would look like, where so you still have the compliance box, the gray box. You start with the left top side, the objective. So the organization may say that, okay, we want to increase our new customers by 20%, or we want a 12% market share in the next 3 years, or we want to get 30% of our revenue from outside Europe in the next 5 years. So every organization defines some strategy and then they set out some strategic objectives. And then in order to achieve those objectives, you need some investments and capital. And that sort of is where then so you raise money, and then or you have you allocate budgets, to the different teams, where they have to then go and decide how they allocate that budget. So in order to achieve those objectives, you need to have a set of processes and activities you need to execute. So those processes may be building new products, selling those products, helping our existing customers, making sure our customers don't leave us. So there are lots of processes and activities an organization have to implement. And in order to implement those processes, you need people who will then be executing those activities. You need tangible assets. So you need office space, you need servers, you need computers, you need furniture. You need to provide to your people or to those processes. And then you need intangible assets. So that may be software, information about your customers, skill set you have within your organization. So we invest those three aspects: the people, the tangible asset, intangible asset. But the only purpose of those three is to make sure your organization is able to execute those processes which you want to execute. And the measure of your success will be if those processes create value for the organization, then you will be able to achieve your objectives. But if those processes are not adding value, then of course you will not be able to achieve your objective. So you can look at this from either an organization perspective, or you can look at it from a department perspective. So if I was at Barclays, I was the head of retail bank, I may be given a certain objectives, I may be given a certain budget of, let's say, 800 million pounds. And now as the head of retail bank at Barclays, I need to decide how am I going to allocate my 800 million pounds, in what processes, what people do we need, what tangible asset, what intangible asset. And then I need to always stay within those compliance boundaries. So as a business, that's what First Line is trying to do. And the risks are part of what they're trying to do. So if one organization say we want to grow by 40% and one organization say we want to grow by 5%, then by just setting those objectives, they are exposing the organization to different set of risk profile. So the risks are connected with the strategic objectives. Similarly, when you're raising the capital, so if you're raising the capital from the shareholders, then there is a risk on whether your share price will go up, whether you'll be able to pay dividends. If you're raising that capital from private investors, then they will have certain expectations on returns. So there are a lot of risks an organization is taking in terms of where that capital gets raised from, and then what do they need to deliver to the individuals who are providing that capital. Similarly, how you design and execute your processes. So whether your processes are very manual, then there'll be a lot of risks associated with them. But if your processes are automated, then it'll have different set of risks associated with them. Whether you execute your process in-house or you outsource that process will have different set of risk profile. So your risks come based on how you define and execute those processes. Similarly, if you have people, then people can make mistakes. So you're exposed to the risk of those errors and human mistakes. But then people can also be malicious. So then you have the fraud and the conduct and all those risks you need to manage, because you have people who are helping you execute those processes. And then you have tangible and intangible asset which has value, and because they have value, somebody else may be interested in stealing them, and then stealing that value, or those assets may deteriorate if you do not maintain them. So just because you own that particular asset, that ownership then exposes your organization to certain risks. So then you also need to then look at the risks associated with those tangible and intangible assets. And there is no mention of risk management team here. So whether an organization has a risk management department or not, those risks are going to be there. Yeah, depending on what objectives have been set, how you've raised the capital, how you're defining the processes. And this is what we need to get across to the first line, that risk is already part of what they're doing. We just have to sort of make it a little bit more transparent and a little bit more conscious so that they can understand why managing risk is important for them. Because if they don't manage the risk, they will not be able to create that value. They will not be able to achieve the objectives, and then they don't get their bonuses, they don't get their promotions, they don't get their salary increase, and so on. So this is a very high level view of what is happening from the first line perspective. And then we want to use this language. So when we did that course at UK Finance, I was surprised that this language is not being used, not used that widely within financial services industry. But we need to start using this term, because these two terms, they sort of bring the first line and the second line together, but in a more holistic way. So let's look at value creation. So value creation are all the measures which are undertaken to create value that directly contributes to the strategic objectives. So whatever your organization's strategic objective is, if you do something which will directly contribute to that, then those are all value creation activities. So if you provide a website to your customers so that they can buy your financial products, then the activity of developing that website, maintaining that website, is a value creation activity, because it directly contributes to you being able to get more customers and increase your revenue. Provide online banking website for customers to manage their funds. So that's, again, because if you don't do that, your competitors may do that, and the customers will go to your competitors, they won't come to you. So providing that facility, it gives you that competitive advantage, or it removes a competitive disadvantage. And then operating a sales team to sell financial products to clients would be another value creation activity, because if you have that sales team, they are selling and you are able to get the revenue. On the right hand side is where we have value protection, which is where you're saying measures undertaken to ensure firms' ability to create value in the long term is not affected. Yeah, because we have to deal with a lot of uncertainties. Just because we have a website, doesn't mean that we will get however many customers we need. So we also need to focus on value protection. And this is where examples could be preventing criminals from using your financial products for money laundering. So that would be part of the value protection activity. It doesn't directly contribute to increase in revenue. In fact, yeah, it's the opposite, right? It reduces your revenue, but you need, because of the regulations and practices, you want to stop criminals using your financial products for money laundering, preventing cyber criminals from gaining access to customer accounts, preventing sales team from mis-selling financial products to clients, because we need all those value protection, because if you don't do that, then things may happen which will affect our ability to create value. And that's where a lot of the operational risk initiatives then are on the right hand side. So if you look at all the operational risks and controls, they will fall into that value protection bucket. And if you look at an example, so typically when this value creation, value protection is used, in certain metaphors are used. So a racing car is one of the metaphor used, where you say that value creation is like the accelerators in the car, where it allows you to go really fast, and value protection is compared to as brakes. But if you want to be a winning car, you need to have the best accelerators and you need to have the best brakes. You can't say that, oh no, we need the best accelerators and our brake can be sort of semi okay. We don't need the best brakes, because if you're racing and there is a bend, you need to brake to turn, otherwise you sort of clash into the barriers and you're out of the race. Then you need both. So for a successful organization, so this is what we need to get across to the first line, that value creation, value protection, they go hand in hand. And first line should be looking at both of these aspects. They can't just be focusing on value creation and not do value protection, because if they don't invest in value protection, their ability to create value will get deteriorated over a period of time. Another example which is used is a football team, where the attackers are considered as value creation, and then the defenders and the goalkeepers are compared to as value protection. And again, if you want to be successful, you want to win the Premier League or you want to win the World Cup, then you need you need a team which has the best attackers and the best defenders. So if your attackers score 20 goals and you don't have a very good defense, and your opposition scores 21 goals, you still lose. So both value creation and value protection, they go hand in hand. They are intertwined. You can't say that, oh, I will only focus on value creation and I will only focus on value protection. But because this language is not used, there is no way for us to do that communication with the first line team. And this is where that friction comes in, because where the first line team is focusing on value creation, the second line team is focusing on value protection. And then there is that tension where the second line is not appreciating what the first line is trying to do, and the first line is not appreciating what the second line is trying to do, because we sort of engaging in a cross purpose. And that sort of is the challenge, where the second line teams need to get a little bit more conscious of the value creation aspect, so that all the discussion with the first line is not just about value protection, but it also, hey, if you manage this risk, then this revenue target you have of earning 500 million pounds by end of the year, there is a better likelihood of you achieving that revenue target if you manage these three risks correctly in the next 12 months. So the second line team need to be a little bit more conscious of value creation, and the first line teams need to be a little bit more conscious about value protection. And then we need to work as a team rather than trying to sort of work separately. And this language of value creation, value protection allows the two teams, to sort of come together, that at the end of the day, we're here for creating value, we're here for achieving those objectives. And as part of that, we need to do the value protection aspect also. So let's expand that a little bit, because I think this is very important activity. And then there were sort of practitioners during that course where they said they especially found the football analogy useful to say that, okay, what is the role of value protection in helping the first line do what they're trying to do on the day-to-day basis. So let's expand this, where you're looking at strategic objectives. So at the end of the day, you need to focus. First line cares about achieving those strategic objectives, and that's where second line needs to make sure that we tie in whatever we are doing with those strategic objectives of what matters to first line. And then there are two types of value creation in every organization. So there is the direct value creation, where you have like the direct sales activities, the product development activities, where those activities directly convert into revenue or profit or cost saving. And then you have the support value creation, which is where then you have the support functions like IT, finance, HR. So what HR is doing is not directly contributing to getting revenue, but they are hiring the salespeople. And if they hire the right salespeople, they're able to find good talent, then those salespeople can go and get us more revenue. So there is the support functions, and value protection needs to be part of both of those. So in the direct value creation, you may have KYC checks or detecting suspicious customer transactions that they may not be money laundering, or detecting potential credit card fraud. So those are all examples of value protection measures you need to have in place in the activities of your organization where value is directly getting created. And then in the support part of your organization, you also need value protection. So that's where, doing new vendor due diligence, where you're entering into a relationship with a new vendor. So it's not direct value creation, so it's support value creation, but you're still exposing organization to certain risks. So we also need to then think about value protection. Doing the background check as part of hiring, encrypting the data when we give laptops to all the employees, so that if they forget the laptop on the train, somebody is not able to get access to all the customer or company information. So there are value protection aspects which need to be then part of both the direct value creation and the support value creation activity. And there are some value protection which can be independent. So this will typically be your governance. So like your internal audit may not be embedded either in direct value creation or support value creation, but what internal audit doing is playing a key value protection role. Same to do with your risk committees and audit committees, where they may not be embedded in any first line function. They may be completely independent. So you can also have some value protection aspects not embedded in the day-to-day first line processes. And this is where, when I've done the course and I've asked that question, saying, okay, if you're what percentage of the budget of the organization gets invested in value creation, and what percentage gets invested in value protection, then here is what sort of we have discussed on the different courses. So if you are a new fintech firm, because you're new, you don't have a lot of value, you haven't created a lot of value, you still don't have to comply with lots of regulations, you don't have
yes, it wasn't. No.
You don't have that many customers, you don't have that many product, you don't have that much market share. So so a fintech may be able to invest 80% of its budget in.
Sorry, I'm here. I thought I was. I thought it was.
In value creation, and then a very small percentage on value protection. If you're a new challenger bank, then you need you invest maybe 20-25% of the budget on value protection. If you're a large national bank, then it may be around 40%. If you're a large global bank, then you need to invest a lot more on value protection, because you have a lot of value to protect. You have lots of operations, lots of customers, lots of compliance regulations you need to comply with. So for a large global bank, they may be spending 50, 60, 65% of their budget on value protection. And think of that value protection as everything in credit risk, market risk, operational risk, strategic risk. So all that goes as part of the value protection. So it depends on sort of your size of the organization, but it's a good analysis to do to see if you're allocating budget to a particular department, how do they allocate that budget between value creation and value protection activity. Because if they're allocating 80% for value creation and only 20% for value protection, then that things are going to go wrong. But if they're allocating 80% on value protection and only 20% on value creation, then that they may be able to manage their risk, but they're not going to be very successful in the medium to long term from a financial performance perspective. So it's a good analysis to do to see how a first line function, and especially with the head of the business unit, it'll be good to have that conversation, with the head of regional bank or head of investment bank, because they are making those decisions on how they allocate their budget, to see if they have a sense of what percentage of that budget is going in value creation versus value protection. And this is what then a head of the business unit is doing, that as soon as they get a budget, so if I was the head of a retail bank for Barclays, I get £800 million for 2020, and I'm given some objectives that I need to get, these revenue targets, these profitability targets. So now I have to decide, okay, how am I going to allocate this £800 million in value creation and value protection? do I need to invest in certain processes where we need to invest more in our call center, for example, that if we are going to do a lot of marketing and we don't have enough call center staff, then we need to increase the call center staff so that customers, when they want to buy insurance or credit card products, they're not having to wait very long. On the call. So then that'll be an investment in processes for value creation. But if I have to invest in processes of daily backups, we need to take, then that would be a value protection. Then I have to allocate some of my 800 million pound on a value protection measure. Similarly, if I'm hiring more salespeople, then I'm investing in value creation. But if I'm hiring more cyber risk experts, then I'm investing in value protection. If I have to, set up a new office so that we can uh, place our new employees, the new sales team we're going to hire, then I'm investing in tangible asset from a value creation perspective. But if I have to buy a backup center so that our employees can go and work there when there is a terrorist attack or a flooding, then that would be an investment in tangible asset, but for value protection perspective. Similarly, if I have to invest in getting expertise, that I need some experts who can come and build some innovative retail banking products, then I may invest in getting those individuals on board. I may go to a consultancy organization to give me that expertise on how to create innovative products. Then that would be investment in intangible asset for value creation. But if I need expertise on how to improve my risk assessment processes, or how do we define our risk appetite, if we're buying that sort of expertise, then we're investing in the value protection aspect, but from an intangible asset perspective. So as a first line, every head of the business unit, they are making these decisions, but they may not see those decisions as highlighted on the slide here. And then you have the key stakeholders on the value creation side. So you have your board, your senior executives, sales, marketing, and then from the value protection, you have in the risk team, the risk committees, the internal auditors, compliance, BCM team. And then you see that line between the two, the inherent dilemma to allocate resources between value creation and value protection. That sort of is where the tension is, that once a head of the business unit gets that 800 million pounds, how are they deciding how much of that to allocate to value creation, how much of that to allocate to value protection? And they need to do both, right? So we're not saying that they can invest all 800 million pound in value creation, because then they will not be successful. They'll have to be really, really lucky to be successful if they don't invest anything in value protection, or they invest very little in value protection. Okay. So this is what then is happening within an organization, or maybe happening in most organization, where you have a objective at the high level. So I've just taken a fictitious bank here called RWS Bank, which has retail banking, insurance, and then there are some corporate functions within retail banking. It has retail banking and credit cards. And then within that retail banking, it has a sales team where they have a branch sales team and they have an online sales team. So that sort of is the organization hierarchy. And the organization may say that at the group level, we want to increase our revenue by 15%. So that would be one of the strategic objectives. And that gets cascaded down. So the head of the retail bank may have then the objective that they need to increase the revenue by 18%. And only if they do that, and the head of the insurance also does whatever objective is given to that, then overall at a group level, we will be able to increase our revenue by 15%. So in that case, a group level objective has been cascaded to a head of a division. Then the head of the division may cascade this down. So he would say that, okay, we have retail banking credit cards. So the retail banking team, they need to increase the revenue by 16% for the retail bank to achieve its objective. And then they would cascade it down further. And then at the end, you will end up with the online sales team. So whoever is the head of online sales team, they would get the target that they need to increase the revenue by 25%. So this is how typically objectives may get cascaded down, so that every head of the business unit then knows what they need to contribute, that if they do whatever their targets are, and if everybody else does whatever the targets are, then the organization overall will be able to achieve the objective. The division overall will be able to achieve those objectives. So this is what is happening then maybe on a yearly basis in organizations where you have your annual strategy. Those objectives get cascaded down. And then when you're allocating that, when you're allocating an objective to a specific individual, so in this case, we have the head of retail banking where she gets assigned as the owner for increasing the revenue by 16%. And then we set her compensation. So we say that, okay, head of retail banking, you'll receive a bonus of 250,000 at the end of the year. If you are able to increase the revenue by 14 to 16%, you'll get a 300,000 if the revenue increases more than 16%. You get a bonus of only 50,000 if the revenue increases between 10 and 13%, and no bonus if the revenue increase is less than 10%. So we are immediately then tying the company objective to what matters to that individual, because that, for the head of the retail banking, the revenue target is not the motivation, the compensation they will get by achieving that objective, that is their motivation on which will drive how they allocate the 800 million pound given to them between value creation and value protection. And you can't do that clearly for all the heads of the department. So in this case, if you have the head of IT, we can't give the increased revenue target to the head of IT because they are in the support function, they are not in the direct value creation. So then you have to create a derived objective which the head of IT needs to achieve. So in this case, we give an objective that the head of IT needs to maintain that the unplanned outages of the online retail banking website is kept to less than 30 minutes over the financial year. So we say, okay, that's your objective. Now you need to make sure you achieve that objective, because if you do that, then it'll help us achieve our objective of increasing our revenue. But it's not a direct connection. And then we set out the bonus to say that, okay, if the disruption is between 15 and 30 minutes, you get 75,000 pounds. If the disruption is 1 to 14 minutes, you'll get 100,000 pounds. If there are no outages, you get 150. If you receive, there's a disruption of more than 30 minutes during the year, then you're not getting any bonus. So we try and then align those company objectives to the personal objectives of as many senior executives we can within the organization. And then once that has been done, then the head of retail banking will allocate the resources, because now they have a budget, they have been given a objective, and they know if they achieve that objective, what it means for them personally. So now there's also a personal incentive. So they have to now decide that, okay, how are they going to allocate the 800 million pound between the various value creation and value protection? And the objective for them is to maximize the likelihood of achieving the revenue objective in this case. And that sort of becomes a key differentiator. So the executives who are able to find the right balance between value creation and value protection will be more successful in the long term. But if you are just focusing on value creation and you're not focusing on value protection, then you may be successful 1 year, 2 years, you may be lucky for 3 years, but at some point things will catch up, and those executives will not be successful, in the long term, unless they keep changing they keep going from one company to another, and then just repeat that exercise and make sure they get out before the 2 or 3 years. And that's an issue. Then the second line team needs to be aware if that is what is happening. Then the second bullet point is that, so she'll be inherently motivated. So she will manage the risks, because she knows that, okay, she has to manage the risk for her to be able to achieve the company objective, for her to be able to achieve the personal objective. So you don't need to give any more incentives to her to manage the risk, because now we've already tied her personal objective and the company objective. But however, she may not use the same language as you want her to use. So she may have come from different organizations. She may be using certain terms like issues or threats. She may not be using the terms which the risk team wants to use, and that's where there is then that exercise to get them familiar with those terms, because if the head of retail banking is using different set of terms and the head of insurance is using different set of terms, and they're going into a risk committee meeting or a board meeting, and then one is saying issue and one is saying threat and one is saying risk, then you have a jumble of terms. So there is that learning to do to see, okay, what terms are being used in the different functions and see if the second line team can actually standardize the use of those terms. And then she may also have, her personal preferences in terms of how she prioritizes the risk. So, she may use some methodology. It may not be the inherent risk and the residual risk methodology, but she will be thinking about that risks because, she needs to make sure that by managing those risks, she will be able to achieve her objectives. And then what the group risk team, so this is where the oversight and challenge function needs to come in play. The last bullet point is to make sure that the head of retail bank is not compromising, that they're not putting 90% of their budget in value creation and they're only putting 10% in value protection. Because then that, it may be good for her to get her personal compensation, but for the organization, it's not good. And that's where the second line team needs to watch out for those gaming which may happen, or if they're not able to do that, then internal audit should certainly be looking at whether there are some head of businesses who are trying to game the system by maximizing the investment on value creation and compromising, and then they may want to get their annual bonus and then go to some other organization. So they don't care if there are some incidents which start to happen in 18 months time, they'll be gone in 12 months time. And that's where the challenger and the oversight aspect of risk needs to come in, where you need to keep an eye on how the first line is trying to invest between the value creation and value protection. Okay, so we'll just do one more and then we'll pause for this particular session. So this just brings everything together, where on the left top side, you start with selecting your strategy, you cascade your strategic objectives at different parts of the organization, you align the strategic objectives with the individual performance objectives. So you give them some personal reason on why they should be motivated to achieve those corporate objectives. And then you align them with the compensation. And then once that is done, then those individuals are making the decisions in terms of launching a new product, or hiring more cyber risk experts, or increasing the security of the online banking mobile application. So then those first line senior executives are making those decisions and they're taking certain actions. And those decisions and actions are then the distribution between the value creation and value protection. And if they get that balance right, then there will be the actual performance of that particular business unit. And then you want to check whether that actual performance, is it aligned with the objectives of that particular senior executive, and is it aligned with what the organization is trying to do from a strategy perspective. And I've given you the red stars on all the places where risks are coming. So depending on your strategy, what strategy you select, you're getting exposed to certain risks, how you cascade down those objectives, and what sort of motivation you give to the different business executives also will expose organization to risk. And then I'll just cover this and then we stop. So this is where, because I was talking about the risk, this gives a better overview, where depending on your strategy is where the new risk may be introduced into your risk profile, or it may change the exposure. And then if your personal objectives are then aligned to sort of your short-term business objective, then that may influence the risk-taking and the conduct behavior on how you're aligning your company objective and then the personal objectives and the compensation. And then the decisions and actions which are being taken is also then influencing what the risk exposure, because every decision then may bring new risk into the organization, or it may change the level of exposure of existing operational risk. Okay, so this is where we're looking at the world from the first line perspective. So this is happening all in the first line. It may not happen exactly, but the key concepts of having the strategy, what are the objectives, how do we align that, and then how we align the compensation, and then what they do from the day-to-day basis. So this is happening in the first line, whether the operas team has an oversight of this or not, but the second line operas team, you need to be aware, or find out a little bit more about how all this is happening, because depending on how those objectives are getting cascaded down, how individuals are getting compensated, the daily decisions and the actions of the first line are driving. And you need to know, because you need to know what will motivate the first line to manage risk in a proactive way. And if we don't know that, then it becomes very difficult to embed the management of risk in that day-to-day process. So I'll pause on this slide. So we'll continue from this point onwards when we get together for our next session in March. Let me just check. Okay, so there's lots of comments here. So let me just show you, first of all, where we will have the discussion. So on the LinkedIn group, so there is a LinkedIn group which RiskSpotlight managers call the Operational Risk Emerging Topics and Learnings. So if you're not already a member, just send us a invitation, and then we will sort of make you the member. And that's where I've just created a post here called Questions from the Online Workshop Series, Integrating the Management. So I will post all the questions onto this chat, so we can then continue the discussion after this session also. So we have about 6 minutes. So let me see if I can address anything specific while we are on the phone, and then the rest of the questions I'll post it on that particular LinkedIn group. But please do make a note of this operational risk, emerging topics and learning. So you need to search for that. Okay, so there's a question around slides and videos. So yes, we will share the slides and videos. Then there's one question about in the proposed solution, I have not seen the use of data analytics, machine learning, AI. So of course, all of that is useful, but they are sort of specific tools. But you need to implement some idea using AI. So what we are doing in this session is we're talking about those ideas and practices, and then AI can be very useful, to help implement some of the ideas. But definitely AI, analytics, machine learning can play a significant role in improving the ownership of first line. So that was one of the questions. So I'll post that and the response. How to convince the top management that risk team should be involved in strategic decisions and not a box ticking exercise. So that's one of the questions. How to convince the top management that risk team should be involved in strategic decisions and not a box ticking exercise. So we're going to touch this in the next session, but the answer really is the chief risk officer. That it entirely depends on who the chief risk officer is in the organization. That if the chief risk officers have come from compliance or audit type background and they just focused on value protection, then of course the way they communicate to the board and the senior executives, they may see risk management as only adding value from a value protection perspective. But if you have a chief risk officer who really wants to add value or sees that risk management can be a strategic tool, it can be a business tool, then the way they communicate the benefits of risk management will be very different. So it really depends on what kind of chief risk officer you have in your organization, and also the head of operational risk, in the operational risk context, that if the head of operational risk, have come from audit compliance background, then they may sort of see that their focus is only on value protection, which is not going to help you implement these ideas, because only if you want these tools to help the first line achieve those objectives, because the first line doesn't care about risks, they care about achieving those objectives. We just need them to be aware that by managing the risk, they can increase the likelihood of achieving those objectives, and we need to then train them, give them some simple tools so they can do that. We can't just tell them, okay, you go and start managing the risk. We need to give them some simple tools. We need to be their coach. We need to be their guides. And then, if they start to do naughty things, then that's where the challenger and the oversight part of the op risk team, should step in. The internal audit team should step in. But you need a chief risk officer who believes that risk management can be a strategic tool, and if they believe it, then they should be able to sell that to the boards and organizations where risk management is not considered in those strategic discussion. It sort of boils down to the chief risk officer. Okay, so that's all we have time for in this session. So thank you very much for attending this session. We'll follow up. Yeah, you'll get an email with the slides, with the recording, and then I'll post all of these questions on that chat so we can continue. We can continue the dialogue on there. And then, yeah, we are looking for 4 to 5 organizations who, if you sort of look at the ideas, we haven't gone into that many hands-on aspect so far. So we're still trying to sort of understand the world from the first line perspective. But yeah, if you think you want to be one of those organizations where we can come and help to implement this, then do let me know. So we can also then set up that small group separately and then build these ideas and implement these ideas and then come and share the learnings with the rest of the group. So thank you very much for your time today. I will close the session now, and then I'll see you in the next session in March. Goodbye.